The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, beginning with the 16th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat.' He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with a dishonest wealth, who will entrust you to the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
I invite you to be seated. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. This morning, Jesus tells a parable about a rich man and his steward. For both scholars and pastors, this is one of Jesus' most confusing parables, let us say. A wealthy man has in his employ a steward. And in the ancient world, remember, a steward had a great deal of power. In many instances, the word of the steward was the same as that of the Lord. The steward could manage the household and its servants and properties, direct farming and manufacturing operations, and lease, buy, and sell. The steward handled the owner's money and was empowered to lend it with interest. Honestly, if given the opportunity during this time period, you wanted to be a steward. The wealthy owner gets word that his steward is squandering his wealth. He calls the steward in to get an accounting. None seems to be forthcoming, and so the master plans to release the steward. Now, up until this moment, the steward has not done a very good job at managing the owner's wealth. But suddenly, the steward realizes, he may be out of a job, and soon. So what does he do? He goes to those who owe his employer while he still has the power to make a difference. "How much do you owe?" he asks each individual client indebted to the owner. And when they answer with one amount, he will decrease what they owe, thus incurring their gratitude and hopefully future business and goodwill. He is, in a sense, by his actions, creating future relationships with his shrewdness, relationships that will benefit both parties. Now, the owner sees his shrewdness and rewards the man by giving him back his position as steward, as manager of all that he has. Now, as you can imagine, this doesn't really sit well with most of us. right? Because we're sitting there going, hello, this man was, kind of dishonest, to say the least, manipulative, and he's further squandering the owner's wealth. But that's not how the steward sees it. That's not how the manager of the steward sees it. See, he looks at the steward and he sees something totally different. In his eyes, the steward took the situation he was being put in and did what he could to survive it. He did not bemoan his faith. He did not give up. He looked at his options and picked the best one for his own survival. Now, you and I may not agree with the steward's incentives, but we cannot deny that he has acted shrewdly in his dealings. You see, the owner wants his money, his resources managed by someone who is going to do the best he can with whatever situation he finds himself in. And what the steward has proven is that given the right circumstances, he can be shrewd in his dealings. He can come up to the task. He'll be able to manage the money quite well if given the chance once again. But there is something even more significant which the steward learns that his master may be affirming by this parable. And that is the relationship between money and people. The relationship between money and other people, our neighbor. The steward is in danger of losing his position, his wealth, and the security created from having both. And so he endeavors to create a community by cutting the debt of several of his clients, a community that is going to support him in the future. You see, those who the bill he had cut would feel gratitude, and they would feel beholden. And so they would respond to him in like manner, like a neighbor. They would invite him into their homes at a time of need. The steward did not realize the privilege or the gifts he truly had until he was threatened with the possibility of having them taken away. What the steward will learn is that it is not his wealth alone that will provide him security, but the giving away of his wealth to others, allowing him to create lasting relationships of community. This, the steward will discover, is where his true security lies. The rich man is not judging the steward's motivations, but his resulting actions. This is a little bit different than we tend to think. And so now the owner sees his shrewdness and rewards the man by giving him back his position as steward, as manager of all that he has. Money and wealth then becomes a means to creating relationships that benefit both the giver and the receiver. When we manage our wealth well, we benefit those in our care. When we are able to give abundantly from what we have, thereby we benefit our communities. Money is utilized for the common good. This is the lesson Jesus wants to convey to his disciples. But this is really an interesting thing because we get caught up in the morals of it. We get caught up in, well, what was in his heart? What did he really want? Right? We think, well, if you're doing this out of purely selfish reasons, then that's not such a good thing. We're not looking at what he does or what the impact of it is. When I taught 8th grade early American history, one of our first units was on the Industrial Revolution. And we began by looking at some of the key players in the development of this revolution. John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, J.P. Morgan, and Thomas Edison. And the question I have for my students was this: were these men captains of industry? or robber barons. These men constructed a bold vision for modern America and transformed the greatest industries of our time, including oil, rail, steel, shipping, automobiles, and finance. They were unequivocally America's first captains of industry. Thomas Edison gave us the light bulb. Think what it would have been with, having what it would have been without having light, right? We take it for granted. Look at all these lights here. We don't even think twice about it. J.P. Morgan founded the banking system, giving us one of the strongest financial systems with which to run this country. His bank was so strong that during the Depression, the U.S. government looked to him for help. He also had one of the largest art collections in the world, and when he died, he left his art to the American people. He also left his own personal library to the public, now known as the Piermont Library. John D. Rockefeller created Standard Oil. Shrewd, not a risk taker, but a shrewd businessman. He amassed millions. At 56, he retired and turned his attention to philanthropic endeavors. He gave away more than $530 million to various causes. Now, just to put this in perspective, remember this is like in the early 1900s, late 1900s. So the money, when you think 530 million, think now billions, okay? This is, 530 million isn't all that much. Well, it'd be great for me, but but in general, in the scheme of things, it's not a lot. The richest men in the world are like billionaires. So they would be billionaires. So just so you get a clear understanding of their wealth. Okay, these were the richest men in the world at the time. And as I said, he gave away more than $530 million, exponentially, right, billions. His money helped pay for the creation of the University of Chicago, as well as the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, later named Rockefeller University in New York, as well as the Rockefeller Foundation. Then there was Andrew Carnegie, who owned Carnegie Steel, the largest in the world. In 1901, Carnegie made a dramatic change in his life. He sold his business to the United States Steel Corporation, started by legendary financier J.P. Morgan. The sale earned him more than $200 million. And at the age of 65, Carnegie decided to spend the rest of his days helping others. Carnegie was an avid reader for much of his life, so he donated approximately $5 million to the New York Public Library so that the library could open several branches in 1901. More than 2,800 libraries were opened with his support. Devoted to learning, he established the Carnegie Institute of Technology at Pittsburgh, which is now known as Carnegie Mellon University, in 1904. The next year, he created the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching in 1905. With his strong interest in peace, he formed the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in 1910. Now, these are just some of the ways these men donated their wealth for the common good. They did not shy away from using their personal gifts, their wealth, and resources in the world. But let me share with you another side of these men. They were also brutal, and I mean brutal, in regards to their employees and with those they competed. They had no qualms about wiping out the competitor and destroying other men. None whatsoever. They did not treat their employees like human beings. They were ruthless and they were cruel. Many have criticized their policies and ethics with regard to business, and with those, as I said, they employed. They have also been referred to not just as captains of industries, but robber barons. However, at the same time, many would contend that these men helped build the economic and social structures of this country. So which ones are they? Captains of industry or robber barons? Should we trust our wealth to them? Should we trust that they can do a good, look at their incentives. They were greedy. I just put it out there. They were greedy, they were ruthless, and they wanted what they wanted when they wanted it. But something begins to happen to them as they begin to give their money away. And they develop more and more of an incentive to give their money away. I think Carnegie gave all of his wealth away in the end before he died. Most of them decided to turn their efforts toward creating a structure in the society that would benefit their neighbors and all. What was their incentive? Probably, tax write-offs at the first. But as time went on, their hearts began to change. I have no doubt about that. There is the story of an old, wealthy man whose health has deteriorated so that the only thing he can do is watch the world from his window. He has determined that there is no God and sees such notions as foolishness. After all, what can God give him that he doesn't already have given to him by his own wealth? That which he has earned by the sweat of his brow. As a matter of fact, he determines that the only thing God has given him to date is ill health. And so he sits in his room bitter at life. Looking out the window one day, he sees a woman in the park across the street, sitting in the gazebo where a statue of the Virgin Mary and her son stands, and she is praying. The old man calls one of his servants, who because of his own deafness has become quite proficient at reading lips. She is praying for money for her rent, says the servant to the old man. Silly woman, thinks the old man, God will not answer you. But to show you where the real power lies, I will answer you. And so he instructs his servant to go to the bank and to ensure that the woman has enough money for her rent. He does this anonymously. Well, this kind of feels good to the old man. And so he begins to notice who comes into the park and into the gazebo. He notices who is praying, and he has his servant continue to read the lips and hence the needs of those who are praying. And the old man continues to provide as best he can for the needs of those who are praying. And as he does, a change begins to take place in his heart. His servant begins to notice that he is becoming kinder, more compassionate, even less bitter. And what's even more shocking is he actually seems eager to get up, to get to a spot at the window in order to serve others. The old man begins to feel a joyful presence in his life. And that is when he realizes it is not those who are praying who are the fools, but he himself. For God has been working through him to bring comfort and new life to those whom the old man is able to serve. The old man finally understands and is both awed and grateful for the new life that has also been given to him and the joy that he feels in his spirit. Much like this old man in our story, these men of industry and the steward in our parable this morning did what was right with regard to their actions, not necessarily out of right intentions, but oftentimes out of selfish or ill intentions. However, in the end, they turned their hearts not to money, but to doing something worthwhile with what they had earned. I know Carnegie was guided eventually by a strong spiritual faith, as I said, to give his earnings for the common good, giving all his money away before his life ended. You see, we often say, where your heart is where your money will follow. But what about where your money is? That's where your heart will follow. what you give your attention to, what you give your money to, what you give your resources to, your heart will follow there, not the other way around. And this is some of what Jesus is saying. He's like, we look at this and we look at this parable and think, Jesus. And then you realize what Jesus cares about is the man's right actions, because he knows in the end the man will be changed because of his right actions. When we do that which we are called to do, when we do that which we know is right, even though we don't want to. I mean, how many of you have sat back and said, I know I should be doing this, and I should talk to him, I don't really want to, and I should forgive her, and I should. We don't want to do that. But when we do, it's not just a change in that person, but there's a change in us because our heart follows to that place. You see, Jesus, in the end, doesn't condemn wealth. As a matter of fact, he expects us to be shrewd in the management of what we have been given on this earthly plane. However, he also expects us to remember that wealth is given for the purposes of sharing what we have with others, of creating right relationships with our neighbors. And I want to be clear here, it's not just wealth, in the sense of money, but the wealth of our gifts, the wealth of our resources, the wealth of our time. When we give those, we create right relationships with our neighbors, relationships of justice, compassion, mercy, and care. Our hearts remain centered in God, and we receive the joy of God's presence. And in that way, we are thus serving God, not wealth. Amen.